If you've spent the last few evenings scrolling through spec sheets, watching endless comparison videos, and still feel like you're missing the magic formula for a home lab that actually works for you, this review is here to cut through the noise. You're not alone. Most people who dive into building a dedicated NAS hit the same wall, a board that looks impressive on paper but ends up being a headache to get the most out of. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. What you're really looking for in a NAS motherboard is reliability under constant load, enough bandwidth to keep multiple users happy, and the flexibility to grow without having to rebuild the whole system. The UDP-TCP Ultra 7255H board tries to package all of that into a Mini-ITX form factor, which means you can tuck it into a small chassis and still have room for a decent number of drives. Let's walk through what that actually means when you plug it into a real-world setup, and decide whether it's worth the premium price tag. First off, the board's standout claim is the built-in LPDDR5 memory 32 GB running at 8400 MHz. For NAS, that's a lot more RAM than you typically see, and it's not just about raw numbers. When you're running virtual machines, Docker containers, or heavy snapshot workloads on something like TrueNAS or Unraid, that extra memory acts like a buffer that prevents the system from throttling under multiple simultaneous reads and writes. In my own test rig, I ran 3 VMs for different services, one for Plex transcoding, another for a personal Git server, and a third for a small database while a file sync job was copying 5 terabytes of data. The board never hit a memory ceiling, and the UI stayed responsive. If your NAS is going to be more than just a dumb storage box, that onboard RAM is a genuine time saver. Next, the networking side is where the Ultra 7 really tries to differentiate itself. It ships with 2 Marvell 10GBE ports, each wired directly to the chipset. That means you can aggregate them for up to 20 gigabits per second of throughput, or simply dedicate one to your local network and the other to a backup line without needing an external NIC. In a small office or a media-heavy household, that can translate to smoother 4K streaming and quicker backup windows. I set up a 10GBE switch and connected the board to 2 workstations at the same time. Both could pull multi-gigabyte files from the NAS without any noticeable slowdown, something I rarely see with a single 1GBE port even when the drives themselves are fast. The storage connectivity is another big part of the equation. The board offers a 3 SAS SFF 8087 connector that fans out to 12 SATA ports. In practice, that means you can attach a whole rack of 2.5-inch drives or a few 3.5-inch ones via a backplane without needing extra expansion cards. The conversion isn't perfect. SAS backplanes tend to be a bit pricier than plain SATA, but the flexibility to mix drive types can be useful if you already have a stash of SAS drives from an old server. The downside? Those 12 SATA ports share the same bandwidth as the PCIe 4.0 x 4 lanes, so if you're saturating all drives at once you'll start to see diminishing returns. For most home lab users who aren't constantly pushing 30 terabytes of random reads, it's a non-issue, but power users should be aware. Speaking of PCIe, the board includes a PCIe 4.0 x 8 slot. That's where you can drop in an additional NVMe card for a high-speed cache, or a professional-grade network card if you need more ports. I added a 2 TB PCIe 4.0 NVMe SSD as a read cache for a media library, and the initial load times for large video files dropped from several seconds to under a second. The cache isn't a magic bullet. It works best when the workload has a predictable hot set of data, which is typical for a Plex server where the same movies get requested repeatedly. Now let's talk about the practical side of powering the thing. The board requires a full 24-pin ATX connector plus an additional 8-pin EPS. That's standard for a full-featured board, but it does mean you can't run it off a tiny power brick you might use for a Raspberry Pi style build. You'll need a decent 450W PSU at least, preferably something with a good 12V rail to keep the multiple drives stable. In my experience, the extra power draw is modest. The board itself consumes around 30W idle and spikes to about 80W under full load with all drives active. If you're trying to keep the whole NAS under 50W for a silent, low-heat box, you might look at a more stripped-down solution. Who should consider this board? If you're a tech enthusiast who wants to run multiple services, needs high-speed networking, and plans to expand storage beyond the typical 8-drive limit, the Ultra 7 gives you a lot of headroom. It's also a solid choice for small businesses that want a single box to host backups, file shares, and perhaps a few VMs, without buying separate servers for each function. The onboard.